I don't want to take up any more time because, quite frankly, you're here to listen to Dr. David Wood, who, in my opinion, is the premier Christian apologist and also what I believe is one of the best Islamic scholars talking about Islam from Islamic sources, not talking heads, not from other people's opinions, but what's going on. And if you followed him on YouTube, how many of you are regular YouTube followers? Raise your hand. David doesn't have to look around. He knows he has 42 million views of his 600 plus YouTube videos. And I've been sending those out in our newsletter. We do that. And I urge you to subscribe to his YouTube channel while it's still up. But we keep hoping and praying it'll continue that. But without any further ado, I really am very honored. Please give a warm Texas welcome to Dr. David Wood.
You gotta turn it.
You gotta turn it.
Yeah, we help
It's
him.
behind me.
He can't see it.
Check.
Okay,
We'll get the
we'll
curve
fix
down.
that.
Okay.
Check.
All right. Any jihadis here tonight?
Just right. Just keyboard.
They don't want to mess with Texas, huh? Well, tonight we're going to be, of course, looking at some pretty depressing issues. We're going to be looking at the topic of jihad and a call for the violent subjugation of all of us, which is depressing, and possibly even more depressing is how unwilling people are to even acknowledge it or look at any facts that are relevant to it. So tonight, kind of a downer. Tomorrow will be more uplifting. My wife says I have the spiritual gift of discouragement. So I don't want to I don't want to just bring everyone down. I want to bring you all down tonight, and then tomorrow just lift you back up. It's a cool strategy. We're going to be looking at the topic of jihad, but one of the common criticisms is all religions have their radical elements, and we find violent teachings in the Bible, and so it really makes no sense to criticize Islam for violence because, everyone has the same problem here. And even if we can't see what's wrong with that, even if we don't know much about history or the Bible or the Quran, this kind of doesn't pass the smell test, right? Something smells a little off about this response, and the reason is we see one particular group responsible for many terrorist attacks around the world, and we see people from very different areas of the world coming to very different conclusions. Coming to very similar conclusions about how they are to interact with unbelievers. And so Muslims in Nigeria ethnically are very different from Muslims in Saudi Arabia, or very different ethnically from Muslims in Pakistan and so on. And yet there are groups in all of these places that come to very similar conclusions about how they are to interact with unbelievers. And so that should raise some questions. Why do we find similar patterns emerging in all these areas? Because you can have responses like, well, what about Christians have their extremists too? What about Westboro Baptist Church? Well, if you saw Westboro Baptist churches springing up in completely different areas of the world with almost identical ideologies and practices, I think it would be very, very, very important to look at that movement and so on. But we don't. You have sort of fluke movements in Christianity and every other religion. But when you start seeing the same thing spring up over and over and over again, century after century, country after country, at some point you should start wondering, maybe it has something to do with the teachings of the religion. But again, we want to be consistent here. We want to be consistent. So we're going to look at peace and violence in both Christianity and Islam. I'm assuming many people here are, we're in a church, I'm assuming many people are familiar with what Christianity teaches. So we'll get to the point quickly there, and then whatever standard we can come up with as far as examining Christianity, we'll then apply the same standard to Islam and see if the cases are really as similar as people think. So, for Christianity, we would go to, obviously, the teachings of Jesus, and when we open the teachings of Jesus, we find things like this. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. For he causes his sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous." So here's Jesus, who also commanded his followers to love God with all their heart, soul, mind, and strength, to love their neighbors as themselves. He said that these were the two most important laws, but not just God and not just your neighbor, you love your enemies as well. Notice this would have been a perfect time to say, yeah, but you know, your enemies, kill them. It would have been a good time if that's what he had wanted to teach. If there ever was a time to defend Jesus by going on a killing spree, it would have been right here when soldiers actually came to get Jesus and take him to death. Matthew 26, "Then they came and laid hands on Jesus and seized him, and behold, one of those who were with Jesus reached and drew out his sword and struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his ear." That's smart if you're supposed to be defending Jesus with violence. Then Jesus said to him, "Put your sword back into its place, for all those who take up the sword shall perish by the sword." So if this was to defend Christianity through violence, and Jesus said, this is not the time to defend Christianity with violence, well, we're starting to see a pattern emerge. Later, Jesus is standing before Pilate, and Pilate's asking him questions about what he's up to. Jesus answered, John 18:36, "My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, then my servants would be fighting so that I would not be handed over to the Jews. But as it is, my kingdom is not of this realm." So, Jesus, are you here to start a violent revolution? No. And his response is, if I were, wouldn't my followers be fighting? Wouldn't I have not told them to stop that thing? Right? So, this is Jesus all the way up through his ministry, where he's telling his followers to love God, love their neighbors, love their enemies, and you can hear at the end telling his followers not to fight, and that his kingdom's not of this world, and that's you're not fighting as you would fight for an earthly kingdom. And we can see the impact this had on his followers. We'll look at the writings of the Apostle Paul here. So Romans 12:7, "Never pay back evil for evil to anyone. If it is possible, so far as it depends on you, be at peace with all men." Notice, be at peace with all men, not be at peace with your fellow Christians. "Never take your own revenge, but leave room for the wrath of God. If your enemy is hungry, feed him, and if he is thirsty, give him a drink." Now, where would Paul have gotten that if it weren't for Jesus saying, love your enemies? 1 Corinthians 16:14, "Let all that you do be done in love." 2 Corinthians, "Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh." Very similar to what Jesus said, right? If my kingdom were of this world, then my followers would be fighting. "Though we walk in the flesh, we do not war according to the flesh, for the weapons of our warfare are not of the flesh, but divinely powerful for the destruction of fortresses." Ephesians 5:2, "Walk in love." 1 Thessalonians, "May the Lord cause you to increase and abound in love for one another and for all people." Well, if you're talking about both your friends and your enemies, that's you're supposed to love everyone. "See that no one repays another with evil for evil, but always seek after that which is good for one another and for all people." 1 Timothy 2:1, "I urge that entreaties and prayers, petitions and thanksgivings be made on behalf of all men." Notice those underlined portions there. For all people, on behalf of all men. So this is, yes, we're Christians, but We seek the good of all people. So that's what you find if you look at the commands and teachings that are directed towards Christians on how Christians are to interact with others. Now, this doesn't mean that Christians always have to be nice. Christians can be annoying in preaching the gospel and things like that, and upset people and tell people they'll be judged and things like that. But as far as how we are to interact with them, we're not supposed to be going around violently subjugating them in the name of Jesus. So if Islam is different in that respect, well, that would be a kind of important difference. But people want to respond here, and there are three basic ways you can go if you want to object and say, no, Christianity is actually violent. You have three basic approaches. One, you can go to certain passages in the Old Testament where Joshua was commanded to fight the Canaanites or something like that, and say, you see there, look at this fighting and killing going on, or look at this penalty for this sin that was violent. You can point to those things. Or you can go to actual teachings of Jesus or of his apostles and say, look, here's something he's saying that is actually violent. So all that, talk about loving your enemy and stuff, he didn't really mean that. He said this other thing that's really violent. Or you can point to violent Christians, right? There are plenty of violent Christians down over the centuries. So you can always point to them. Look what that Christian did. This Christian did this violent thing. This Christian country did these awful things to this other country, and so on. So those are the routes you can go. And usually Christians wouldn't want people to go in these routes. And I'm saying this because, again, we're going to make sure whatever standards we apply here, we are consistent when we examine Islam. So if you were to bring up a command to Joshua or something like this and say, look, that's violent or something, well, as Christians, there are passages in the Bible, some that would make us go, ooh, wow, that's rough stuff there. But we do need to keep in mind that, for something to be part of Christianity, it would have to be part of the covenant that we're actually under. And in the Bible, you have a series of covenants. You have God makes a covenant is an agreement God makes with human beings. You do this, and I'm going to do this. So God makes a covenant with Adam. God makes a covenant with Noah. God makes a covenant with Abraham in the Bible. God makes a covenant with Moses and the children of Israel. And eventually, God makes a covenant with Christians through the blood of Christ. And you can have different rules as part of different covenants. So Adam was told, don't eat any animals, plants of the ground. Noah was told, eat anything. Moses was told, you can eat certain things. So you can have different rules that are associated with the different covenants for that time. And so if we are to ask ourselves as Christians, am I supposed to, I've never heard a Christian say, God commanded Joshua to go fight the Canaanites. I really need to find some Canaanites. Because I believe that's directed towards me. Well, you would be insane if you said something like that, right? If you've got all these commands that are specifically directed towards you as part of the covenant that you're under, it would make very little sense to say, now I'm going to go do what wasn't even, that wasn't even commanded as part of any particular covenant. That was a command to Joshua. So if we're asking what are the teachings that are, if we're talking about peace and violence in Christianity, we should be referring to Christianity and the actual covenant that is Christianity. It might be very interesting to go through all the teachings of the Bible and examine their place and so on. But if we're talking about Christianity, we're talking about Christianity. Next is to twist certain New Testament passages, and the most popular one nowadays, I get it every day, multiple times, is that in Luke 19:27, Jesus said, those enemies who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them in front of me. Now, I've seen Christians, when they hear this for the first time, they haven't read their Bibles, they open this up and, whoa, that's red letter. That's right in there. It's red letter. That's Jesus saying that. Oh my goodness, what's going on here? And so they don't have an answer, and now they're stumped. Jesus is going around calling for the deaths of his enemies. Until you go back earlier in the chapter and find out this is all parable. This is a story Jesus is telling about a ruler who goes away and then he comes back and so on. And it's the ruler in the story who says, as for those enemies of mine who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slaughter them before me. Kind of important to include that information when you're examining what a verse means. What's the literary genre? Is this a command to Jesus followers, or is this a command in a story? The reason, so the takeaway message there is we don't want people taking things out of context when they're going to the Bible. We don't want them ripping a verse out, making it sound like Jesus is calling for his followers to go on a killing spree. So we shouldn't do that if we're examining Muslim sources. And finally, of course, you can point to violent Christians. Look at these violent Christians. Look at these horrible things Christians have done to Native Americans. Look at Christians who were involved in the slave trade. Look at all of these things. Well, normally we would want to say, look, if someone is acting contrary to the teachings of Christ, then you can point at that person and say, look at what those awful things those people did. But you wouldn't want to say, this is what Christianity does. You wouldn't point a finger at Christianity unless it's something that Christianity actually commands. And so, to be consistent here, we don't want to point a finger at Muslims who are doing something and say, oh, look what a bad religion this is because these Muslims are doing this or that. You only point a finger at Islam if they're doing that because that's what their religion teaches or encourages. So we have some guidelines here that we would gather from people who would criticize Christianity, who would question Christianity, and we would want to lay down some rules. Hey, don't take things out of context. Make sure you're actually talking about what Christianity teaches if you're addressing Christianity. Feel free, if a Christian is going against the teachings of Christianity, say that's a bad Christian right there. But we have to, if we're talking about Christianity, we're talking about Christianity. And likewise, if we're talking about Islam, then we would want to apply the same rules and see what Islam teaches. So, I'm going to just briefly cover some key terms because I forget to cover terms that I'm using sometimes, and then people come after me afterwards and say, what's the Quran you kept talking about? Oh, okay. So, no problem. Some basic terms here. Allah, that's an Arabic word that means the God, so the God of Islam. Islam, Arabic word that means submission or surrender. And as we'll see, submission is, there's a reason Islam is named submission. That is the key concept in the religion. You submit to Allah. Now, Christians and Jews, if you ask them, do you believe in submitting to God, would usually say yes. And so Muslims actually use this as a preaching point. Hey, you believe in submitting to God, don't you? Yes. Well, Islam is the religion that teaches this. So why wouldn't you come to Islam? Well, Islam doesn't just tell you that you must submit to God. It tells you how you submit to God. And we'll see how you submit to God in a moment. So Islam is the religion. A Muslim is the follower of the religion. So Muslim is the person. It means one who submits. Muhammad is, according to Islam, the last prophet, the seal of the prophets. The Quran is Islam's holiest book, but it's not exactly parallel to the Bible. Muslims believe that this is directly revealed from Allah, who had it in heaven with him for all eternity. He only revealed it to human beings. So this isn't people sitting down who are inspired to write as books of the Bible. This is someone who Muhammad is someone who received a revelation. He had no input into the revelation according to Islam, he just received it. So with respect to the Quran, Muhammad is basically like a mailman, right? He's like, you don't praise the mailman for bringing you a great letter. He just delivered it to you. So you praise him for doing a great job getting that message to you, delivering the letter. And that's what the Quran is. It's Allah's words, no input from Muhammad. And the Hadith. These are other books that are important in Islam because the Quran commands Muslims, again, as we'll see in a moment, that Muslims have to submit to Muhammad as well, Muhammad's teachings and Muhammad's decisions. And if the Quran doesn't contain Muhammad's decisions, those are the decisions of Allah, and Muslims are commanded to obey the decisions of Muhammad, then they have to get those elsewhere. And they get those from the Hadith, which are these massive multi-volume collections of things that Muhammad said in different circumstances. So, if we're talking about what Islam teaches, what is Islam? Fortunately, things have been condensed for us into 2 lists. We have what are called the 5 pillars of Islam. These are basic practices. The 2 lists are basic practices and then basic beliefs, required practices, required beliefs. So the most fundamental practices in Islam are called the 5 pillars. That's the Shahada, that's when the creed that Muslims recite. Salat, these are the 5 daily prayers. Zakat, giving alms. Sawm is fasting, usually associated with the month of Ramadan. And the Hajj, that's where they take the pilgrimage to Mecca and walk circles around the Kaaba and so on. So those are the basic practices. We also have the articles of faith. These are things that Muslims are required to believe, and it's not just a kind of intellectual assent. You're not saying, I believe in God. You have to believe what Islam teaches about God. So you have to believe what Islam teaches about Allah, angels, the inspired books. Notice that's plural, because Islam doesn't just teach that the Quran is inspired by Allah, it teaches that the Torah and the Gospel are also inspired by Allah. Prophets, so not just Muhammad, it's the prophets who came before Muhammad, including the prophets we would be familiar with in the Bible and others that we haven't heard of. The Day of Judgment and predestination. Now, if you have as the foundation of your religion here, the teaching that you submit to God, and then how do you do that? Well, here's a list of basic practices, and here's a list of basic beliefs. Oh, that would sound a lot like lots of other religions right there. You submit to God, and you do it by following these practices and believing these things. That's lots of other religions. So why is Islam different? Well, Islam's different because these beliefs and practices, we have commands over and over again in the Muslim sources to fight over these things. So if you don't submit, if you refuse to submit by doing these practices, believing, then there are calls to fight you over it. So for example, Chapter 9, verse 29 of the Quran. Notice, fight those who believe not in Allah nor the last day. Notice, Allah nor the last day. Those were 2 of the 6 articles of faith, believing what Islam teaches about Allah and the Day of Judgment. So fight those who do not believe in Allah nor the last day. And this is referring specifically to Jews and Christians, but we'll come back to this. So that's from Allah, but also from Muhammad, Sahih Muslim, number 33. This is a collection of hadiths. The Messenger of Allah said, I have been commanded to fight against people till they testify that there is no God but Allah, that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah, and they establish prayer and pay zakat, and if they do it, their blood and property are guaranteed protection on my behalf, except when justified by law, and their affairs rest with Allah. Notice, I've been commanded to fight people till when? Till they stop attacking you? No. I've been called to fight people until they testify, that's the Shahada, that there's no God but Allah, that Muhammad is the Messenger of Allah, and establish prayer, that's Salat, and pay Zakat. Those are 3, these are the first 3 of the 5 pillars of Islam. Muhammad saying, if you don't do what is required in the 5 pillars, then I'm coming to fight you. And it's only once you've submitted and demonstrated your submission to God that you're guaranteed protection on my behalf. So, notice, you have basic practices, basic beliefs, but Islam contains commands to fight over those practices and over those beliefs with people who simply refuse to believe those things or to do those things. So, as far as submission goes, now we'll get down to how submission works, because you can see the attitude towards people who refuse to submit to Allah in the way required by Islam. But the requirements are pretty strict even for Muslims, even for people who do want to submit to Allah and obey Him and obey Muhammad and so on. You can see how strict the requirements are here. Surah 33, verse 36 of the Quran, it is not fitting for a believer, man or woman, when a matter has been decided by Allah and His Messenger, to have any option about their decision. If anyone disobeys Allah and His Messenger, he is indeed on the clearly wrong path. So once a decision has been made, there is no room for disagreement here. Chapter 4, verse 65. But know by your Lord, they can have no faith. Notice you have no real Islamic faith. They can have no faith until they make you, O Muhammad, judge in all disputes between them, and find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and accept them with full submission. Submission is not just submission to Allah. Allah commands you, right here, to submit to Muhammad, all his decisions. And notice, you can't even find in yourself any resistance against one of Muhammad's decisions. If you do, what's it say? You're not a real Muslim. God, David, you're saying that Muslims have to mindlessly accept everything? No, I didn't. Allah did. I didn't say it. Just telling you what he said. So, think about that. And by the way, the impact this has had on the Muslim community over the years. These kinds of teaching make it very easy to accuse someone of not being a real Muslim, being an apostate or a heretic or something like this. If your daughter is not wearing appropriate Islamic attire, and you've told her she knows what is appropriate Islamic attire, well, guess what? You're not a real Muslim. So now you recited the Shahada, that meant you were a Muslim, but now you're no longer a Muslim, now you're an apostate. It's a justification for honor killings. So, here you really, really, really have to submit completely to everything Allah and Muhammad say. Now, with respect to the commands of Allah, this shouldn't be terribly difficult to figure out what Allah requires, because Allah claims over and over again, like a beating drum, that His commands are perfectly clear. So, chapter 11, verse 1, this is a book whose verses have been made firm and free from imperfection, and then they have been expounded in detail. 12:1, these are verses of the clear book. 15:1, these are the verses of the book and of a Quran that makes things clear. 24:46, certainly we have revealed clear communications. 26:2, these are the verses of the book that makes things clear. 27:1, these are verses of the Quran, the book that makes things clear. 28:2, these are verses of the book that makes things clear. 57:9, he it is who sends down clear communications upon his servant, that he may bring you forth from utter darkness into light. And think about what happens when we put those things together. Allah claims that once He has made a decision, once He has given a command, you have no option but obedience. And He tells you that His commands are perfectly clear. So once you read a command from Allah, you can't be saying, maybe He really means, well, if He really meant what you think He meant, this other thing that you think He meant, then you're saying He's not clear, and you're more clear. Wait a minute, Allah had all eternity to get His word exactly like He wanted until it was absolutely perfect. He reveals it to you, and off the top of your head you can say something better. You see why there's hostility towards groups that have anything other than just completely fundamental Islamic teachings. Now there's a problem here, of course. Namely that you can go through the Quran, and sometimes you find a command telling you to do one thing, and other times you find a command telling you to do something else. You can be reading the Quran and it'll say that the penalty for sexual sin is house arrest. You can keep reading and later it will tell you that the penalty for sexual sin is 100 lashes. But wait a minute, I thought Allah's revelations were perfectly clear. What am I supposed to do here? Well, the Quran actually has a solution that makes all of this perfectly clear. It lays down a doctrine called abrogation. Chapter 2, verse 106 of the Quran, whatever communications we abrogate or cause to be forgotten, we bring one better than it or like it. Do you not know that Allah has power over all things? So the historical background of this verse was that the unbelievers started making fun of the Muslims for believing in Muhammad because Muhammad kept telling his followers different things. He would tell them one thing and then later he would tell them something else. And the critics were saying, hey, this looks like he's making this up as he goes along. The solution was that Allah revealed, what are you talking about? I can abrogate revelations and then give you something better than it or like it. I have power over all things, don't I? So, when you have different teachings in the Quran telling you to do two different things, there's actually a solution. Which one came last? That's the one that abrogates or cancels the earlier revelation. It's not a contradiction, it's different revelations for different circumstances. So that's the Islamic method of interpreting different texts. So once we do this, once we understand, wait a minute, Allah says that His revelations are clear, you have to obey them without question, without having any disagreement, any questioning of them inside of you. You just have to obey. And that's, again, they're clear. They're clear enough to do that. And if they ever don't seem clear because you've got commands to do different things, then you've got a doctrine called abrogation, where the question is which one came last. That solves the problem. Okay. Well, when we do this with the Quran, with the Muslim sources, we start seeing a pattern emerge as far as the teachings of Islam on how to interact with unbelievers, or even with hypocrites. And the pattern goes something like this. There are three stages here. And right now we're just talking about the pattern that emerged in the life of Muhammad and how the revelations of the Quran corresponded with what was going on in the life of Muhammad. So at first, Muhammad is a prophet in Mecca. He has very few followers, and when Muhammad had very few followers, well, he was preaching a certain message. So stage one, when Muhammad and his followers were only a tiny minority of the population, they were commanded to preach a message of peace and tolerance, religious tolerance. That's our message of Islam. And a characteristic verse from this time, chapter 109, to you be your religion and to me be my religion. You're having a disagreement, you're having arguments, people trying to get you to convert. Hey, to you be your religion, to me be my religion. That's nice. Now, what's interesting here is that even though this is what Muhammad was telling his followers to preach, tolerance, don't fight back. In fact, during this time, don't even fight back in self-defense. Weren't even allowed to fight in self-defense. But behind the scenes, things were a bit different. History about Tabari, volume 6, page 95. Abu Talib, that's Muhammad's uncle who was protecting him. Abu Talib sent for the messenger of Allah. So basically, people kept coming to Muhammad's uncle saying, Muhammad won't stop making fun of our religion, he won't stop making fun of our gods, could you do something about this? So Abu Talib sent for the messenger of Allah, and when he came in, he said, nephew, here are the sheikhs and nobles of your tribe. They have asked for justice against you, that you should desist from reviling their gods, and they will lead you to your God. Notice, that's pretty reasonable, right? Stop making fun of our gods, we'll leave you alone. Stop making fun of our gods, and you can, go about your business. Uncle, he said, shall I not summon them to something which is better for them than their gods? What do you summon them to? He asked. So there's something better than your gods. What do you summon them to? He asked. He replied, I summon them to utter a saying through which the Arabs will submit to them and they will rule over the non-Arabs. So even when Muhammad was powerless in Mecca, preaching a message of peace, he's already thinking about conquering the Arabs and the non-Arabs. Guess what? That's all of us too. I summon them to utter a saying through which the Arabs will submit to them and they will rule over the non-Arabs. Abu Jahl said from among the gathering, what is it, by your father? We will give you it and 10 like it. He answered that you should say there's no deity but Allah. In other words, submit to Islam as the truth, in which case you'll also have to submit to Muhammad as a prophet. Now think about this, because Muhammad is going around. Peace and tolerance, ladies and gentlemen. God will eventually judge us. God will eventually sort this out. But let's not kill each other here in this time when I'm in a total minority and you all would crush me in a physical confrontation. Let's not fight about this here. Islam is all about peace and tolerance. To you be your religion, to me be my religion. Behind closed doors. Guys, if you join me, I'll have an army and we can conquer all these people. Now, what's going on there? He's saying one thing in public, and behind closed doors, he's talking to his tribe. Guys, all I need is an army here. Trust me on this one. Well, later expounded upon this in the Quran, chapter 3, verse 28. Let not the believers take disbelievers for their friends in preference to believers. Whoso doeth that hath no connection with Allah. You have no connection with Allah if you take if you take disbelievers as your friends instead of believers. Whoso doeth that hath no connection with Allah, unless it be that you but guard yourselves against them, taking as it were security. Don't be friends with unbelievers. You have no connection to Allah if you're friends with unbelievers, unless it's to guard yourselves against them. And by the way, this is where we get the word taqiyya from. As an explanation, so you don't think that I'm reading something into this, I'll give you the most respected Islamic commentator in history on this. This is the commentary of Ibn Kathir. He's commenting on this verse of the Quran. So what does that mean here, Ibn Kathir? So commenting on, unless you indeed fear a danger from them. Meaning, except those believers who in some areas or times fear for their safety from the disbelievers. In this case, such believers are allowed to show friendship to the disbelievers outwardly, but never inwardly. For instance, Al-Bukhari, that's the most respected hadith collector of all time, Al-Bukhari recorded that Abu Darda, that's one of Muhammad's companions, said, "We smile in the face of some people, although our hearts curse them." Al-Bukhari said that Al-Hasan, that's another of Muhammad's companions, said, "Taqiyya is allowed until the day of resurrection." So think about this. Muhammad is in Mecca. We know because it says it, that he wants to go out and conquer. But even though he wants to conquer, he's in no position to conquer until he has an army to do so. So what is his message? Guys, it's all about peace and tolerance here. What is he doing? He's doing exactly what the doctrine was later laid down in the Quran. So, stage one, if you're completely tolerant, why? Because that's what's in the best interest of the community at that time, under those circumstances. But Islam didn't end there. Muhammad eventually left Mecca, moved to Medina, formed alliances with other tribes who agreed to protect him, won very many more followers. More people were coming in to become Muslims, and that's when the revelations of the Quran changed to something else. Stage two, when Muhammad had gained a larger following and formed alliances with various tribes, but wasn't yet strong enough to subjugate the unbelievers, he was ordered to wage defensive jihad. Defensive jihad. You're fighting, but someone else has to start it first. They have to do something. Now, there's a much broader concept of self-defense in the Islamic teachings. Doesn't mean an army is marching out against you. Someone can just be making fun of your religion or something like that. You can defend yourself against that with violence. But the point is, you're not just randomly going out and fighting people. Someone else has to do something to you first. Characteristic passage here, chapter 2, verses 190 to 193 of the Quran. And fight in the way of Allah with those who fight with you. Notice, who are you fighting here? Fight with those who fight with you. They're fighting you, so you fight them. That's self-defense. And do not exceed the limits. So don't go beyond that. Surely Allah does not love those who exceed the limits. And kill them wherever you find them, and drive them out from whence they drove you out. And persecution is severer than slaughter. And do not fight with them at the sacred mosque until they fight with you in it. But if they do fight you, then slay them, such is the recompense of the unbelievers. But if they desist, if they stop fighting you, then surely Allah is forgiving, merciful. And fight with them until there is no persecution, and religion should be only for Allah. But if they desist, then there should be no hostility except against the oppressors. If they stop bothering you, then no hostility except against the oppressors. So this is filled with teachings about fighting someone who's doing something to you first. And lots of Muslims will point to these kinds of passages and say, you see there, Islam allows fighting in self-defense. Well, what's wrong with that? Who doesn't believe in self-defense? Well, this wouldn't be a terrible problem if this were the final revelation of Islam, and it's not, because there are more changes to be had. At this point, again, Muhammad had formed alliances. He was strong enough to fight, but not strong enough to take over. And so if you're strong enough to fight, then you fight against people who are causing you problems. Why? That's what's in the best interest of the Muslim community during that time. But though that wasn't the end. Later, Muhammad becomes the most powerful force in Mecca, and the revelations changed again. So stage 3 of jihad. When Muhammad and his followers became the most powerful force in Arabia, they were commanded to wage offensive jihad, violently subjugating non-Muslims simply for being non-Muslims. Here it's not, hey, you've attacked us, or you've tried to oppress us, or you've persecuted us. It's, you're an unbeliever, convert or die. Or in the case of Jews and Christians, pay the jizya and acknowledge that you're inferior. So, some of the revelations associated with this phase. Keep in mind, because people get confused when I'm quoting Surah 9 here, the Quran is not arranged chronologically. So if you see a higher number, like we read from chapter 109, chapter 109 is one of the early revelations. The Quran is not arranged chronologically. Some brilliant people early on in Islam decided that they would arrange it, apart from the prayer at the beginning, they would arrange it from the longest chapter to the shortest, instead of here's how the revelations unfolded. And so very confusing. You have to actually go outside the Quran to figure out, you have to go outside of the Quran to figure out when passages were revealed, and you need to know when they were revealed in order to understand what abrogates what. So that's just an interesting little fact about the Quran, because the Quran claims to be clear, and yet you have to go outside of the Quran to figure out when things were revealed, so you know what abrogates what, so you can clarify what the Quran is saying. But the last major surah of the Quran that was revealed, the last lengthy chapter of the Quran that was revealed, was the 9th chapter, Surah 9. So these are the final marching orders. And why do I bring up the final marching orders? Because when we're talking about Christianity, and you say, hey, Christianity believes in lots of revelations over time, lots of prophets over time. If you're talking about Christianity, and you want to know, does Christianity promote violence or something, the main question should be, what's the final takeaway? What are the final marching orders? What am I commanded to do as a Christian now? Well, I'm commanded to love God, I'm commanded to love my neighbor, I'm commanded to love my enemies, and so on. That's what I'm commanded to do now. Those are the final marching orders of Christianity. Well, in Surah 9, now you have the final marching orders of a religion that specifically says, two revelations seem like they're contradicting each other, throw out the earlier one. So these are the final marching orders. And it's things like, fight those who do not believe in Allah. Read that earlier. Chapter 9, verse 73, O prophet, strive hard against the unbelievers and the hypocrites and be unyielding to them. Notice, you're not just supposed to fight unbelievers here. And by the way, strive hard there is wage jihad. In Arabic, it's wage jihad. Wage jihad not just against unbelievers, so Christians, Jews, polytheists, also against hypocrites, people who say they're Muslims but aren't really Muslims. Which Muslims aren't really Muslims? They shall have no faith till they make you, Muhammad, judge in all disputes, find in themselves no resistance against your decisions, and submit to them with full submission. This is a recipe for a bloodbath here, by the way. It's a recipe for an ongoing, endless bloodbath. Wage jihad against hypocrites. Who are the hypocrites? Anyone who does anything other than exactly what Allah and Muhammad say. Oh, okay. Well, I've never met a Muslim. I can't point to something about him and say, you got this wrong. And so, the reason this is interesting, by the way, because remember after ISIS started and President Obama and all the leaders, all the world leaders, after every attack would get up and say, these are not real Muslims because they're killing their fellow Muslims. And as we all know, in Islam you cannot kill your fellow Muslims. Well, you're not supposed to kill your fellow devout, obedient Muslims who have fully submitted to Allah and Muhammad, but you're commanded to fight hypocrites. Now, ISIS, when they're going out to kill Shias, are they killing people that they regard as good, devout people who have submitted wholeheartedly to Allah and Muhammad? Or are they going out and killing people that they regard as hypocrites? So notice, we're told by our politicians, by everyone in the media, by the education system, everyone, these guys are not real Muslims. Why? Because they're doing exactly what Allah commands right here. And everyone knows that you're not supposed to obey what Allah says in Islam. Chapter 9, verse 123, O you who believe, fight those of the unbelievers who are near to you and let them find in you hardness. Notice over and over again, these are commands to fight unbelievers. But maybe it just means unbelievers who are attacking you. Well, if Allah says that His commands are perfectly clear, wouldn't it be more clear if He said, fight those of the unbelievers who happen to be attacking you and only fight them in self-defense? Wouldn't that have been a bit more clear? It's very, very, very difficult to reinterpret commands from a God who says, if you don't do exactly what I say, you're in a lot of trouble. Not just from me in the afterlife, from other people who do take my words more seriously than you do. Chapter 48, verse 29, another of the final revelations of the Quran. Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, and those who are with him, those who are with Muhammad, i.e. Muslims, are severe against disbelievers and merciful among themselves. Notice, this isn't severe against people who are attacking you, severe against people who are oppressing you. Yes, there were passages of the Quran that say that sort of thing, that say you fight the oppressors, you fight the persecutors, you fight people who are bothering you, you fight these people. Yes, there are commands in the Quran that are like that. That's not what these are saying. Here it's severe against disbelievers, merciful among themselves, only merciful towards fellow Muslims. Now, the obvious objection at this point is what's called the context defense. Right? Notice, we did the exact same thing. We would do the exact same thing with the Bible. If you say, look, Jesus says right here, those people who didn't want me to rule over them, bring them here and slay them. You say, would you just read the passage? My goodness, would you read the passage to understand what that is saying? So, perfectly relevant to appeal to context. And we did the same thing on a grander scale when we said, hey, these are the commands that are actually directed towards us. Those commands directed towards Joshua are not directed towards us, so you have to examine the context of the various claims. So this is important for any sort of anything first grade and higher reading comprehension. You have to look at the context of things. So the obvious response here is, oh, okay, look at these verses right here that are saying these things. You're ignoring the context. If you looked at the context, you'd find out that it is just talking about these people who are attacking and killing Muslims. And so it's saying just like them. So, okay. Well, when you appeal to the context of the passage, you can mean two basic things. You can mean the historical context, what was going on when this was revealed, what sort of questions was this meant to answer. Or you can look at the literary context. What does the surrounding text say that might clarify the meaning of this passage? So let's do both for one of these verses. We'll look at 9:29. So here's the historical context of Surah 9, verse 29 of the Quran. Let's fight those who do not believe in Allah. Ibn Kathir, in his Battles of the Prophet, again, most respected Muslim commentator of all time. Allah Most High ordered the believers to prohibit the disbelievers from entering or coming near the sacred mosque. So, the polytheists of Mecca used to take a pilgrimage to Mecca to perform their religious rites at the Kaaba there, and Allah revealed they can't come here anymore. The pagans can't come here anymore. So this is after Muhammad and his followers conquered Mecca. So Allah Most High ordered the believers to prohibit the disbelievers from entering or coming near the sacred mosque. On that, Quraysh, that's Muhammad's tribe, the Quraysh thought that this would reduce their profits from trade. So now you no longer have all these people coming to your city. Right? People would come there and spend money while they're there. Mecca is in the middle of a desert. It doesn't have a lot of natural resources and so on. So it's important, every source of income that they have. Not only that, if you tick off all of the polytheists who believe it's very important for their religion for them to take this pilgrimage, now they don't want to trade with you anymore. Now they don't like you. They'll trade with someone else. So they believed that Muhammad was really, really hurting them by saying, hey, just cut off relations with these guys. So Quraysh thought that this would reduce their profits from trade. Therefore, whenever you see a therefore, you see what it's there for. Therefore, in other words, because of this, Allah Most High compensated them and ordered them to fight the people of the book, Jews and Christians, until they embrace Islam or pay the jizya. And then he quotes chapter 9, verse 28 to 929. And we have, therefore the Messenger of Allah decided to fight the Romans in order to call them to Islam. Now notice, ordered them to fight the people of the book, Jews and Christians, until they embrace Islam or pay the jizya. If you embrace Islam, if they become Muslims, then they pay zakat, which goes to the Muslim government. If they refuse, in order to become a subjugated people, they agree to become dhimmis, then they pay jizya, sort of tribute money. Either way, if you go out, whether they convert or whether they don't convert, now you're making money from them. So, Muhammad, how are we going to make money if you cut off all our relations with all these polytheists? Allah told me we're going to go fight the Jews and the Christians. And they're either going to convert to Islam and pay us, or they're going to remain Jews and Christians and pay us. Either way, they're going to pay us. Why are you still worried about money? Now, that's what the historical context is, and not according to me, not according to Robert Spencer, according to Ibn Kathir, right? And notice, therefore, the Messenger of Allah decided to fight the Romans. Why? Because the Romans were coming and attacking him? No. Where are we getting money? Allah ordered me to go fight the Jews and Christians until they pay us money. Okay, now I'm going to fight the Romans. It's not difficult to understand, right? It's a perfectly straightforward passage. So that's the historical context. Now we'll look at the literary context. In other words, we'll look at the entire passage, not just Surah 9, verse 29. We'll look at the entire passage. The passage begins in 928. So this is the beginning. You can tell when it's starting a new passage because it'll start with, O you who believe. O you who believe, truly the pagans are unclean, so let them not, after this year of theirs, approach the sacred mosque. And if you fear poverty, soon will Allah enrich you, if He wills, out of His bounty, for Allah is all-knowing, all-wise. Notice, it fits in perfectly with the historical background we're given, right? The unbelievers are no longer to take the pilgrimage to Mecca. If you fear poverty, if you're worried, it can enrich you. That's exactly what we read in the historical context, right? So the question is, Allah can enrich you. How's Allah going to enrich you? Next verse. Chapter 9, verse 29. Fight those who believe not in Allah, nor the last day, nor hold that forbidden which hath been forbidden by Allah and His Messenger, nor acknowledge the religion of truth from among the people of the book, until they pay the jizya with willing submission and feel themselves subdued. So, how are we going to make money now? We're going to go out and fight Jews and Christians until they pay you. That's how Allah is going to compensate you for the money you're losing from the pagans. But there is more to this passage. Maybe we're going to read the next verse and it's going to say, and you have to attack the Romans because they're fighting you and attacking you. So let's keep reading, make sure we're not missing something. Chapter 9, verse 30. And the Jews say, Ezra is the son of Allah. No, they don't. No Jews ever said that. Show me a Jew who says Ezra is the son of Allah. And the Jews say, Ezra is the son of Allah. And the Christians say, the Messiah is the son of Allah. These are the words of their mouths. They imitate the saying of those who disbelieved before. Allah's curse be upon them, how they are turned away. Notice, right after it says, fight those who do not believe until they pay the jizya. The obvious question that would have arisen, wait, why are we going to fight the Jews and Christians? I thought they were people they're the people of the book. They're people who've received revelations. Why are we fighting them? Very next verse. If Allah had meant, because they're attacking you, this would have been a really good time to say so. This would have been a really good time to say, oh, and in case you think I'm just talking about going and fighting them over their beliefs, when I said, fight those who do not believe, in case you think I'm telling you to fight over beliefs, no, what I really mean is fight them if they attack you. What does he immediately say? The Jews say, Ezra is the son of Allah. The Christians say, Jesus is the son of Allah. So the only thing that remotely resembles a reason or justification in the context for fighting us happens to do with our beliefs, and specifically what we say. Notice, the Jews say, the Christians say. It's important for what's coming up here. Because maybe we're missing something. Maybe we'll go on and it'll say something else that'll clarify the context for us. 9:31, they took their rabbis and their monks to be their lords besides Allah, and Christ the Son of Mary. Yet they were commanded to worship but one God. There is no God but He. Praise and glory to Him. Far is He from having the partners they associate with Him. Do we have one word so far about anyone attacking, going out and fighting and marching an army, doing anything? It's all complaints about our religious beliefs and what we say and what we practice. So nothing here. All that's going on here is more complaints about our religions. Maybe there's something here. Chapter 9, verse 32. They desire to put out the light of Allah with their mouths. Notice, not with their swords, not with tanks, not with marching armies. They desire to put out the light of Allah with their mouths, but Allah will not allow but that His light should be perfected, even though the unbelievers may detest it. Watch. We desire to put out the light of Allah with our mouths. What's that referring to? The Jews say Ezra is the son of Allah. The Christians say Jesus is the son of Allah. We're attempting to put out what Allah has taught with the things we say. And this is the only justification we have in this entire passage for why anyone would fight us. Last verse. It is He who hath sent His messenger with guidance and the religion of truth to prevail it over all religion, even though the idolaters may detest it. So we are trying to put out Allah's light by what we say, and Allah's not going to allow us to do it. How's He going to stop it? Well, He sent the religion of truth to prevail it over all religion. How is this going to work? How is Islam prevailing over all religion going to stop us from what we say? How's Allah going to do this? We already read it, fight those who do not believe in Allah, until we feel ourselves subdued. Once you've entered into the dhimmi agreement, you're not allowed to go out and preach. So we have the solution to this big problem here. That's the end of, we just read the entire passage. Was there a single hint, a single syllable that this has anything to do with people coming at Muslims in a threatening manner or trying to kill them? Not one word. Every complaint about us has to do with our religious beliefs and practices. That's the entire justification for fighting us. And yet, Muslims will still want to say, what it really means is, and that's the problem. Right? Allah says His words are perfectly clear. If Allah really meant, we've read the entire passage, if Allah really meant in this passage, fight in self-defense, Allah would be the worst communicator in all of history. This is the absolute word, if that's what He meant. See, now I don't think this is unclear. I think this is perfectly clear what this is saying. In other words, oddly enough, I have more respect for the words of Allah than many Muslims in the West. I at least let Allah speak for Himself and say, okay, that's obviously what the Quran means here. Muslims, I don't like that, so let me just say there's something else. So, here's what we have. This chapter is the last major surah revealed. These are the final marching orders, and the final marching orders of the Quran are to violently subjugate Jews and Christians. And we read other passages from there that they're supposed to fight unbelievers and hypocrites. This is a recipe calling for the global subjugation of the entire world to keep people from trying to put out the light of Allah with all our false beliefs and our false preaching. So, if there's an attack from people who are trying to carry out Allah's commands, trying to subjugate the world, and we say, look what Islam teaches. We read a verse and hey, that sounds like that's what Islam teaches. And the response comes, all religions have their extremists and there's violence in the Bible. Is that really a meaningful response to what's going on here? No. If you read both books and read them in the order, so that you can get the final marching orders. The final marching orders for Christians, love everyone. Final marching orders for, according to Muhammad, subjugate everyone. So, if a Christian goes out and decides he's going to subjugate everyone, a Christian can do that, and Christians have done that. Christians have said, we're going to go out and subjugate people. We're going to make them believe what we believe. Christians have done that. Well, guess what? That's not what you're told to do. So that's you being disobedient. If a Muslim says, hey, I'm going to go out and violently subjugate people in the name of Allah, well, then that would be exactly what Islam commands in certain circumstances. And just to be clear, Islam doesn't command Muslims to fight in every circumstance. I think the best way of interpreting this text is not just temporal abrogation, not just this one came later, therefore this one cancels the earlier one, and then the earlier one never applies. But situational abrogation. Namely, what situation are you in? Look at Muhammad when he was in that situation, and then do what he did. So if you're in an area of the world where Muslims are a tiny portion of the population, look to what Muhammad did when he and his followers were a tiny portion of the population. And what's really amazing is you can look to any country in this world, and it follows this pattern. Show me a country that does not follow this pattern. If you look at places where Islam is the most powerful force, it just dominates the population. It doesn't matter if you're talking Sunnis or Shias. Iran is dominated by Shias. Go preach the gospel there and see what happens to you. You're a second-class citizen. Saudi Arabia, dominated by Sunnis. Go preach the gospel there, see what happens to you. You're a second-class citizen if you're there. So notice that's exactly what we would expect from the Muslim sources, and that's exactly what Muhammad's followers did. Muhammad's followers being commanded by Muhammad in that situation, that's what he did. Now we go out and subjugate everyone based on their beliefs. Go to other parts of the world, certain places in Africa, for instance, where Muslims make up 20, 30% of the population or so on. They're not powerful enough to take over the country, but I dare you to make a cartoon about Muhammad in that country. There will be a violent reaction towards you. Well, why would there be a violent reaction? That's defensive jihad. You're doing something to us, you started it, now we have to react. Go to a place like the United States, where Muslims make up about 1% of the population. What's the message of Islam? Peace and tolerance. That's what Islam's all about. Now, here, just to be clear, when I'm talking about Muslims doing what's in the best interest of their community in a certain place, I don't mean that if a Muslim tells you that Islam's religion of peace, he's trying to trick you, he actually knows that he eventually wants to subjugate you and so on. Some do. And we know that some do because some get caught, right? After the 9/11 attacks, there were Muslims on being interviewed by the media. Oh, this is totally against Islam. Then they catch them later behind the scenes, secret recordings praising the attackers. So we know that there are Muslims who will say, no, Islam's religion of peace, even though they don't really believe it and they want to subjugate you. In other words, they're imitating Muhammad's companions. We smile in their faces while cursing them in our hearts. We know there are Muslims like that, but there are also Muslims who genuinely believe that Islam is peaceful and that it doesn't call for violence except in any situation, except in situations that have to do with self-defense. So you can fight in self-defense, and they believe that's all that Islam calls for. I'm saying this because there are lots of people who think, oh, this Muslim told me Islam's a religion of peace, he's practicing taqiyya. No, that Muslim might believe it, grew up in the West. In other words, I know lots of former Muslims. My friend Nabil, he converted to Christianity. He didn't say, when I was saying Islam's a religion of peace, I was really planning to kill you the whole time. Good thing I converted to Christianity. He didn't say that. He genuinely believed that Islam was a religion of peace. But here, the same thing that we said with respect to Christianity. What about violent Christians? Well, we're not talking about the people who may be following their religion or not following their religion. We're talking about the religion here. And this is what Islam teaches. And notice, was there anything confusing? There's nothing confusing in these passages, right? When you read the entire passage, it's as clear as day what this passage is saying. And yet you can roll all our politicians and leaders and educators up into a great big ball. We just can't figure this out. It's so hard. So, and that's why I said that things are a bit depressing. But again, I don't want to just use my gift of discouragement. I want to encourage people, and that will be more tomorrow. So, should we take some questions, or?
Yeah, before we do that, I want to make a couple announcements.
You'll need to turn it on.
We will take some questions.
We'll take some questions over here. We'll ask you, before we do the questions, to argue with him after they had already had it explained to them. And so suddenly Paul was their enemy for telling them the truth. And that's what Galatians 4:16 stands for. And what it means is that I'm now your enemy for telling you the truth. So David's been speaking the truth. We try to do that on a quarterly basis. Once a quarter, we try to bring in speakers like this. So we encourage you, if you did not fill out and give us your email name or email address and others, to put you on our mailing list. We hope you'll let us do that and to continue to bring these kind of speakers. So we'll ask you not to have dissertations, but just to ask a question. So if I pinch you on the arm, it means you're in the dissertation mode. So get to your question. So I promise I won't pinch you unless you violate that simple rule, if that's okay with you, Dave. Okay.
Pinch anyone you want.
I should have worn thicker sleeves. I was in college on 9/11 here at a university in San Antonio, and within a year they decided to change from being the Crusaders to being the Cardinals. And I kind of felt like, well, why don't we just go straight to being the Pansies? I felt like as if that was their attempt at trying to have peace in our time. And this is at the same university that for the last several months, there was a club on campus who wanted to bring you to speak. And since then, no, and not just no, but no way. And the club has been put on probation and suspended for doing so. And they were told, no, he's a problematic speaker. What say you?
I am problematic.
Dave, I explained this to Dave earlier. We worked with the college Republicans at University of Incarnate Word. This was supposed to be a debate tonight, or a dialogue. We wrote to 14 imams here in the San Antonio area. We asked them to be willing to debate David. None of them responded. The university, the club there was going to sponsor the event, a large event there, but their willingness at the University of Incarnate Word to have us and to have David speak was, as Karen described, rather disappointing. And their club was actually put on probation for even attempting to do that. So that's the kind of stifling of speech that we've had here in our colleges. So it's ongoing. David, you've experienced that at other colleges. You were talking about that earlier today. What are some other kinds of experiences where freedom of speech are being robbed from?
I took the club president to meet the community outreach director for the Muslim Education Center here. We sat around a table with him, and he was all for, oh, sure, I'd be happy to take part in a dialogue on campus and everything. And then he looked you up. And 2 hours later, we got an email with the same message. Forget about it.
Yeah, well, that's. I mean, think about this, right? You take topics like, something like jihad, or whether ISIS is Islamic, or whether any of these other terrorist groups are actually obeying the teachings of Islam. It really seems like that would be an important matter to discuss, right? Doesn't that seem like, hey, guess what? If Islam doesn't teach that, I would love to know it, because I can quit saying that it does, right? So if I'm wrong, I would love it if someone would just show me that I'm wrong about these things. But think about this. You've got terrorist attacks, and they never stop, right? Over and over again, terrorist attacks in Muslim countries and non-Muslim countries. In Muslim countries, it's different Muslim sects competing for the authority there. In non-Muslim countries, if it's places like Nigeria, where Muslims are approaching half the population, then they're actually trying to take over the country. If it's places like the United States, there's no hope of just straightforward just marching and taking over the country. So you have to do other things, but terrorism can be a part of discouraging the United States from getting involved in things in Muslim affairs and so on. And so we look at all of this and we say, hey, it would be a good idea to get to the bottom of this. And one side is constantly saying, let's get together and discuss this and bring forth our sources and get to the bottom of this. And then the other side is constantly saying, no, let's do everything to make sure that no one ever gets together to discuss this seriously, unless it's just people getting together to agree that Islam doesn't teach these things. And that's generally what they mean by interfaith dialogue. Let's all get together and agree that Islam is peaceful and tolerant. Can we do that, please?
Thanks. Hold on, you good?
Yeah, I got it.
You got it, all right. First of all, Brother Dan, welcome to San Antonio, and I share the condolences with Brother Nabil.
Are you related to the Iron Sheik?
No, sir. No, he's way bigger than me. No, he's Iranian, I'm Texan. I'll just get straight to my question. How do we justify, or how do we use what the early church fathers, such as like St. Augustine, said about just war? I'm not sure we're going to cover that tomorrow. I won't be here. I'll be at work. So that was my question. How do we justify that, or how do we use that?
I wrote an article on I think on Islam and just war theory for the Christian Research Journal. So you might be, I don't know if they post it online or you'd have to actually get it. But it's interesting that, I mean, you have a few.
Summarize the just war theory for those who may.
Just war theory is war should only be conducted in certain circumstances, and then, even then, there should be many moral considerations when you're conducting this war. And in the end, you should be trying to help people. You don't want them to go back to being, whatever they were doing to make you have to go to war with them, but you don't just want to slaughter them all either, right? You're regarding them as, created in the image of God. How can we help them after we've won? So there are all sorts of considerations that went into just war theory, but you had some mentions of things along those lines about conducting a just war among the Roman writers, but the people who actually started as a full-fledged movement were Christians, from Augustine on up, Aquinas. So they talk about, we have wars and lots of nasty things go on in wars. How can we sort of minimize the nasty things, right? You don't want to go in there and be raping people and slaughtering people, just, you don't want to do these kinds of things. How can we make this as just as possible? And this really brings together some things that you have in the Bible. On the one hand, we're told everyone's created in the image of God. We're told to love everyone. We're told to try and live in peace with everyone as far as it depends on us. We're told these things, and yet we're also told that governments have authority, and they're there to punish wrongdoers and so on. And so, obviously, if someone like Hitler rises up, then we would expect our government to go and do something about that. That's governments. That's part of their purpose. And so, how do you reconcile this? Well, governments are supposed to go and crack down on wrongdoing, and governments can use violence, and governments do bear the sword, and yet we're supposed to love everyone. Well, these things come together as just war theory. Namely, governments have to do things at certain times. They have to fight at times for the good of humanity, for the good of their own people, but you have to do this in the context of certain moral considerations. So that's the just war theory. How this really comes into play is, one, that's an impact that Christianity had on the world. Back in the day, you could do all kinds of things that would just horrify us today. But the other part of the relevance is pointing to things that Muhammad did and saying, how does this line up with what is now considered just war theory? Because in Muhammad's time, you went and you conquered a tribe. You could take the women back to your tent and just rape them, right? So that would be how I would use just war theory. I would use it as a contribution of Christianity to, and again, what's important is these are things that almost every nation in the world agrees with today. Guess what? They didn't agree with them back then, right? There was a bunch of weird Christian nonsense you guys are trying to preach, right? Whereas now everyone agrees this, so it's another way that Christianity has made an impact on the world. But it would, if we're judging Muhammad by the standards of just war theory, it's going to come up pretty short.
If you have any questions online, any of our online folks, if you're listening, you can still type in your questions. We'll do that. We also have an Islamic Speakers Bureau. We don't have a lot of David Woods. He's not cloned yet. We'd love to. But here in San Antonio, we have a group of people who speak on these types of topics, not nearly as well as David. So if your group, your pastors, your churches want this kind of information, or your civic groups want this kind of information, please see me afterwards. or write to us at g416patriots@gmail.com. We'll be happy to arrange a time to come out and give small group presentations to neighborhood groups, churches, or whatever.
Hey,
So,
you can't downplay your speakers. You should be.
What's-
These guys make David look like an idiot, right? Whoa!
So, no, that's, we're going to end up doing very well, thanks to David and all the work he's done. He's taught so many of us, so again, we're very grateful. Yes, sir.
Hey, thanks for being here. Appreciate it. Oftentimes in my dialogues with Muslim believers, usually they come over from like immigrant families. They've been born here, they've been raised in Western culture, but their parents are from the Middle East. And an argument that I always find, especially on like YouTube and stuff, is the Crusades. And I know that you mentioned some things with like I can't remember the name, but basically the taxes that they would have to pay whenever the jizya tax. So I was wondering if you could maybe expound on that, because I know that that's something that I hear a lot from critics.
How do you defend against the illustration of Christians going in with the Crusades?
Well, that would be one of the things I was thinking of when I mentioned that you can always point to Christians and say, look, these Christians did violent things, therefore you can't talk about, if a Muslim does violent things, you can't talk about that because you'd just be a hypocrite. So that was the point of going to actual text and saying, are these Christians actually following what the text teach? With that said, you do have to be clear about things like the Crusades, because up until about a century ago, this was just regarded, in the Muslim world, this was just regarded as a war between the Christian West and the Muslim East that Muslims eventually won. But over the last century, it's morphed into something that is completely historically inaccurate. Namely, there's a bunch of Muslims and they're minding their business in the Middle East, and a bunch of Christians decide to go over and start attacking them. And Christians just kept attacking them. These evil Christians just kept doing these things, and then the Christians eventually lost. And that's what almost every college student nowadays would tell you happened in the Crusades, and it's absolute nonsense. Muslims fought their way across northern Africa into Spain. They were attacking both sides of Europe. They had established pirate havens all along the southern coast of Europe. If you had a shipping industry, you had to pay these guys off, or they were taking your stuff, seizing, kidnapping any women who were present, and so on. And Christian pilgrims who would want to go take pilgrimages to holy Christian sites, which were in the Middle East, if you went there, you would be taken and held for ransom. They would have to pay you to get you back. So these are the considerations. The idea was, hey, there is an invasion coming here. We need to take the battle over there and get it off our turf, right? And insofar as that is concerned, that's a good idea. That's a good military strategy. With that said, Christians during the Crusades did some horrifying and bad things. So one, we want to clarify what actually happened in the Crusades, because you get a very different picture from what's presented. But even when you have an accurate picture, you can still say, look, there were some people doing some very bad things. And guess what? If they're doing bad things that go against the Bible, then you say they're bad Christians, not that Christianity is bad.
And this is one of the topics, we cover a lot of topics in the Truth in Textbook Project. Islam is just one of them. We talk about climate change and a lot of things. But what David just described in the question, we see that time and time again, describe that, and we go back and correct that information, as well as when they ask about jihad or other kinds of things. So what David is doing and what others are doing is what we're trying, because it starts in the textbooks. It's been there since the 70s, and we've been trying, and we've only now just started, but David's points are right on. So you have a great question, young man. We'll go ahead and ask David.
Well, first I'd like to thank you for a brilliant answer to that previous question, because I grew up in the UK, you might be able to tell, and I got her as fast as I could though, but yeah, we were taught that in middle school, that the Crusaders just, so that was a good answer. But yeah, my question is, what role do you think that the military intervention in the Middle East over the past 100 or so years has played in the conflict in not just the Middle East, but also the inspiration of groups like ISIS?
Well, it's had a couple different effects. So the Muslims had a massive empire right up through World War I there, and then they lose, and then they're under the control their territories are under the control because they lost. And for the next several decades, there was a huge impact that they lost because they just got a superior culture to ours. Right? In other words, Islamic culture lost because this other culture is just superior and more powerful to us. And if you look, if you look at photographs from Iran from the 60s and 70s, you've seen these, right? Before the revolution, you'd think you were in Florida if you didn't know where you were, right? They were imitating Western culture. And lots of people did this. Why? Because, I mean, think about this. Allah says that Islam is, if you read all the Muslim sources, the picture you're going to get is Islam's just going to keep expanding and keep expanding and keep expanding until Islam dominates the entire world. Muhammad said he'd been given a vision by Allah. He saw everything from the east, everything from the west, and the authority of his ummah, the community of Muslims ruled over everything. So that's the picture. And then all of a sudden, wait a minute, these guys, everyone around us can mop the floor with us. From an Islamic perspective, that is a massive disconfirmation of your entire belief system and theology. So for many Muslims during this time started adopting Western culture, Western styles of dress, lots of Western thinking on different topics and so on. But there is another possible response there. Right? There's another possible reaction to that massive defeat. And that's not, hey, they beat us because their culture is better than ours. It's, we haven't been devout, obedient Muslims, blessed by Allah. And therefore, if we want to be able to compete with them, we need to crack down. We need to crack down on all heresy, on all rebellion. We need to, and so now you have the rise of various like Salafi type movements and so on. And the most recent and most extreme example, of course, would be ISIS. But tons of people contact me, if ISIS is really Islam, why are they going after fellow Muslims and not after Jews or something like that? Think about this. The rapid expansion of Islam, you had Muhammad. Muhammad took over Arabia, basically. And then Muhammad died. And a bunch of people rebelled against Islam in various ways. Some people just apostatized. In other words, the only reason they were Muslims is because they were scared of Muhammad. Muhammad died, cool, we're free from Islam. Other people still wanted to be Muslims, but they didn't want to do what Abu Bakr said. So they wanted to pay their zakat. They still wanted to be good Muslims paying their zakat, giving their alms. You don't just walk up and give it to a person on the street. You give it to the government decides how to distribute it. They didn't want to give it to the government of Abu Bakr. They still wanted to give alms, but I'm just going to go give alms locally, something like that. I'm not giving it to you. I don't know you. I don't know what your authority is. Abu Bakr declares war on everybody, whether you completely left Islam or whether you just weren't doing some Islamic practice correctly. Abu Bakr said, if you don't give me a piece of rope that you used to give Muhammad, I'm coming to kill you. So that's how serious it was. It's not just, hey, as long as you're generally following Islam, you're okay. No, you have to be following every little detail or I'm coming to kill you. So Abu Bakr is completely successful. He totally just cleanses this community of all rebellion, all resistance, all apostasy. And then the Islamic community just explodes. It goes westward, all the way up into Europe, and eastward, eventually all the way to India and China and everywhere else, right? So this is a massively, rapidly expanding movement. And so if you're looking at things today, what did Abu Bakr do? First, he cracked down on the Muslim community to purify it of apostasy and heresy. That's when Allah blessed it to go and conquer everyone. And we look at the Muslim community today, look at all these silly practices and all these people who don't take Islam seriously. What do we need to do? We need to crack down on them, have a massive cleansing. And then Allah will bless us to go out and conquer all these Western powers. And it's no coincidence that the war name of the leader of ISIS, the name that he took for himself, is Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the Abu Bakr of Baghdad. And so it's another example where we're told, hey, these guys can't be Muslims. Look, they're doing everything wrong. And they're doing exactly what the first of the rightly guided caliphs did, because they're taking him as a model for what would be successful, as it was successful for him. So as far as the impact of Western military intervention has been helpful to Western nations in certain ways for a time, but then that element, that maybe the only reason they're more powerful than us is because we haven't been strict enough as Muslims. And so you have various movements now as part of Islam cracking down, and the idea is eventually, once they've done that, then they'll be able to conquer us.
I will say, as someone who was in the military for 20 years and served my last 10 years doing in the military, there was no discussion. We could talk about communism, you could dissect that any way you wanted, but my last 10 years until I got out in 99, it still is being done as my friends were there. They're not talking about the ideology of Islam. They're talking about ISIS, they talk about symptoms, they talk about these targets. They do not talk about what David is talking about. And that is at the core of part of the major problem, because the only people who could have taken out the secular leadership, the non-Muslim Muslims that were over there, were countries from the West. There was no one who was going to rise up and take out Saddam. And I'm not saying, not taking him out was an option. I'm just saying taking out Gaddafi, taking out all those. So we've done for them what ISIS and many of the other Muslims, and they would claim that that's Allah using, the enemy to do something in the name of Allah, and we're not even aware of it. So there are so many ways that gets played, and sadly we're still not teaching our military why there's so much green on blue killing right now still of Afghans, of Iraqis, or Syrians who we think are on our side are killing our own soldiers. And I've worked with a lot of those widows, and I can tell you they have a hard time. And if you look at the first paragraph of the Constitution of Iraq and Afghanistan, it says Islamic law is the highest law of the land. Now, who here would want to send their son, daughter, mother, brother, sister, uncle, aunt to go fight in a war where, if you know the law of the land is Islamic law, that's what you're fighting? And we helped write that Constitution. So
I just wanted to add something to that, because I didn't go in that direction, but that's extremely important. What you were just saying there is that as far as think about it this way: you can have three basic kinds of government situations in a country. You can have a good government and a stable population, right? You can have a good government and a stable population, stable country, or you can have a bad government and a stable country, right? You can have someone like Saddam Hussein in power and still have a stable country. Your family can go, your kids go to school, they work their jobs. If you mess up and annoy Saddam, he's going to kill you, but other than that, you can live a normal life. And then you can have a bad government and just chaos, right? You can't send your kids to school, you can't let your daughter go outside, she's going to be killed and raped or something like this. Just massive anarchy, right? Now, in the West, it's always the goal, we want good, stable governments, right? Good and stable governments. And so for the past several decades, we looked at the Middle East, and we look at these countries, they have all these bad governments, bad, stable governments, right? Bad but stable governments, right? So in Syria, in Iraq, even in Libya, as much of a dirtbag as Gaddafi was, it was relatively stable compared to certain things that have happened since then. Egypt as well. So you have these different places, and we look and say, look at these bad governments. What could we do to help the people there? Oh, well, that's very simple. You get rid of the evil dictator. Why? Because that's what worked in the West, right? That's what worked in America. Oh, we've got a tyrant overseas. Let's get rid of the tyrant, and then everything works. Because, we all want freedom and democracy, and that's how it's going to work. And so that's our thinking. If all else fails, get rid of the dictator, everything else will work out, because the population wants something better. The population will then get something better. That sort of thinking was not made for a place where a bunch of people would love to go on killing sprees against each other, but there's someone who terrifies them all, right? Keep in mind, when Saddam Hussein is captured and put to death, everyone starts blowing up each other's mosques, and we're all confused. Why are they blowing up each other's mosques? Guess what? They wanted to blow up each other's mosques before, but there was someone they were scared of. They were terrified of Saddam, right? So they were terrified because Saddam's going to come. He's just going to come wipe out your entire village. If there's someone there launched a terrorist attack, I don't know who, but I'm going to wipe out your entire village, and then I'll get you. So you have these brutal dictators in power, and we say we don't like brutal dictators. Get rid of the brutal dictator, and then the peaceful population that wants democracy and freedom will rise up, and they'll elect good leaders and so on. Not realizing there are some other elements there that are never going to allow that to happen. And so you take bad, stable governments, and instead of becoming good, stable governments, they become
And we have an example.
bad, chaotic situations.
We have an example of Zaid Zupi, who's a friend of ours. He grew up in Baghdad. Zaid, stand up for him. Zaid grew up in Baghdad. When I was fighting Desert Storm, he was there. And he was a Chaldean Catholic, a Christian there. And life before that, he could live there. His family lived there with Jews, Christians, all other Shias and Sunnis. When the war was over, and in 2003, when we withdrew from there, the very next Friday after that mosque, they had their sermons, they came and showed up on Zaid's father's door and says, you start paying the jizya. And you start paying it now, and if you don't pay it, you're going to be killed. And they stayed there for about 2 months. But illustrating exactly what David just said, he will tell you stories of growing up there that sure, Sodom was bad, but they weren't being kicked out of their home, they weren't being threatened to die, because as long as you didn't mess with the Ba'ath Party, you were fine. But a great point.
Just keep in mind, I'm not defending Saddam Hussein. What I'm saying is there are worse things in the world than a bad dictator keeping a bunch of terrorist groups in check, right? There are worse things in the world, namely getting rid of him and then everyone is free to. Country after country is just being reduced to rubble now. Egypt escaped it because they had a powerful enough military to stop it. But other than that, you start taking out these guys. And Osama Dakdok, I've heard him compare it. He says it's like you have a ton of wolves marching around, and the only thing they're more scared of is a lion who's among them. You take out the lion, and guess what? The wolves now they start tearing things up.
Isn't the Ottoman Empire, which you made reference, the end of the First World War, longest lasting empire in history?
I've never done the math, but
Yeah. Well,
Continuous caliphate from time.
yeah. But anyway, my real point is, our question is, since we had a Minijad, if that's the way you pronounce his name, from Iran, when he was the premier leader there, he wanted a fiery Holocaust to happen in the world, because that would bring out the Mahdi, or the last Imam, out of the well. That's according to their belief. And so he wanted to see a kind of a World War III break out. And isn't that the direction that many Muslims are today, thinking that this is the last chance for Islam and the belief in Allah to spread throughout the world? It has to be now the third jihad. Is that correct?
If you're saying there are many Muslims who would think along those lines, yeah, but there are lots of Muslims who think in various ways. I know a Muslim who had a Muslim friend who worked with Homeland Security. He was an imam. He worked with Homeland Security, helping to capture terrorists. So you think here is a perfect example of a peaceful Muslim helping the U.S. government crack down on terrorism and so on. Anyway, we were talking one day, and I was like, "So, are you ever conflicted about helping a Western government to round up Muslims and so on?" He goes, "No, because see, the terrorists are standing in the way of reestablishing a caliphate, right? These guys are going around fighting. We can't be fighting all the time and attacking various groups and getting Western nations mad at us." We need to just sit back for a little while, allow the caliphate to be reestablished, and then we'll have a caliph, and then we can do what we want. And I was like, whoa, this is the guy he's helping Homeland Security because he eventually wants the reestablished caliphate. that can come and conquer. It's very interesting thinking. But yes, there are many. As far as a general
It's
strategy,
more Shia vein, isn't the third, the Mahdi is within Shiism versus Sunni, is that correct? That's what he was.
They would normally be thinking that, yeah.
Yeah.
As far as it's a good general strategy that you create as much chaos as possible, especially that's losing. If you're on bottom in this fight already, you can only benefit by creating a bunch of chaos and hope that you emerge out of it. Especially if you're used to that kind of difficult leading and other people aren't, right? The United States of America forced us to live in very difficult situations. We haven't had to live like that in a long time. We don't know what to do. And so there are lots of groups right now that want to favor anything that might lead to future chaos in the United States, hoping that Islam will rise up out of the rubble.
I want to also recognize Dr. Mark Pfeiffer and his wife Susan Pfeiffer, right over here. They work with a group called the Christian Institute of Islamic Studies. They go to churches and do exactly what David does, but in a more personal way, in the sense of being able to be there for several days. And they do seminars, teach classes, have online classes, but they can come and give a 1 hour or multiple hour or multiple day session to your congregations and others, and let them hear some of the same information, and also what David's going to talk about tomorrow, how to handle the spirituality, the biblical response. Because tomorrow night in this facility at 6:30, David will be talking about how to handle the Islamic challenge biblically. And I think that's going to be very important. But Mark and them are Christian Institute, Islamic Institute, the Christian Institute of Islamic Studies, tciis.org. But you can learn more about their group also there. So again, we have a lot of resources here in the San Antonio area. We have another question here, sir. What would you like to ask David?
David, I appreciate your videos. As a Christian, I can be disliked, put on probation, or silenced, but it doesn't change who I am, how I act. It doesn't change the joy of Christ in my heart. In dialogue with Nabil, was there ever a moment where your love meant more than the knowledge of back and forth?
What do you mean by that?
Where your actions, your love of Christ in you, where that revealed more to a Muslim, maybe not just Nabil, but where that revealed more than just the back and forth exchanging of information?
I'm not exactly known for
Would it captivate him more with the love of Christ, win him over more than knowledge and wisdom of...
Was there ever an awe moment where he saw the love of Christ in you rather than just, oh, the Bible says this versus the Quran says that?
I doubt it. Other than, I'm just saying, I'm good for smashing stuff. I'm not good for other things. I would say it's kind of revealed in a different way, namely that, in his book, we're just these super nice friends and so on. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that was watered down for a good Christian audience. When we were arguing, we were pretty ruthless when we were arguing. And something would happen, I would be standing there going, "You still don't get this, Nabil? Does God have to get a baseball bat and whack you with a baseball bat? Because it really seems like that's the only thing that'll get your attention here, right? That's how we're talking." And we would go like that for hours until it's 5 o'clock in the morning and we're ready to pass out. Our voices are stripped out and so on. And then, the next day, hey, want to meet up, right? And that's how it was. So it's that, hey, I understand that even though we keep coming at each other, that it's because we have each other's best interests in mind, because there's no other reason to do this here, right? I mean, if why would you spend year after year after year spending so much time with one person in these arguments unless you just really, really, really want that person to know the truth? And so, if you mean, Nabil was just overwhelmed by my charismatic niceness and so on, I don't think
your glow, it didn't win you.
No one's ever been overwhelmed
accused you
by
of
my glow.
Glow. How many of you are not familiar with the story of Nabil Qureshi? Raise your don't Nabil Qureshi. Please briefly give us, who Nabil Qureshi was and a short testimony about how you and him joined together. And I think that's important he'll talk more about that tomorrow night, I'm sure, but for briefly just summarize that, I think it's his memory is just a tremendous testimony.
Nabil was a Muslim I met in college, and we were both on the speech and debate team, and we met on a trip, and he's actually the one that started the conversation, and we spent a lot of that weekend discussing Christianity and Islam, and once he had sort of put together everything he believes, he told me that, Islam is proven true by history and logic and science and everything else, and everything proves Islam and so on. And once he had given his presentation, I said, I have a question. If you're wrong, do you want to know it? And that's an important question because some people say no. It's usually atheists. Right? I say, if you're wrong about that, do you want to know? They go, no. The people who are so dedicated to truth and evidence say no. They don't know the truth and they're wrong. Nabil said yes and no. He said, yes, I would want to know the truth about God, but no, it would destroy my family. And so I went with the yes because that was the better part of him. But those were the two features of Nabil that I watched play out over the next several years because he's always pursuing. He's always ready to let's go through this book. Let's go watch this debate. Let's take notes. Let's compare our arguments. He's always willing to do that. And yet, it's clearly always in his mind, what will this do to my family? And just to be clear, Nabil had the closest family I'd ever seen in my entire life. I come from West Virginia, trailer park, dysfunctional, everyone's an alcoholic background. And so, let me put it this way. We went away on a school trip, the first one. We came back. Nabil's mom hugged him in the parking lot for 10 minutes. I've never been hugged by my mom for more than 10 seconds, right? And so that's how close they were. And as far as, considerations of love, there were times when I would think, man, if this guy ever listens to me, right? If he ever, I'm sitting here, I'm ruining this guy's life if he ever listens to me, right? I'm messing up his entire family. I'm destroying his family. What kind of person am I, right? But Nabil did say yes. He wanted to know the truth. So we focused on discussing Christianity for about the first 2.5 years or so. So we're discussing the reliability of the New Testament, the deity of Christ, Jesus' death and resurrection, and so on. And then somewhere along those lines, I started saying, hey, we're examining Christianity and we're applying a certain level of rigorous skepticism and criticism to our beliefs. What happens if we do that with Islamic beliefs? And so that's when we started examining Muhammad and the Quran as well. So we did that for about another year. And eventually Nabil started having dreams and visions telling him to convert to Christianity. He still wouldn't. That was still months after he was even. I mean, some of them are interesting. The second dream he had one dream, which everyone who interpreted it for him, even when he went by his Islamic dream book, which tells you what different things in your dreams mean. If I had a dream telling me to convert to Buddhism, it's a dream, right? But lots of Muslims take these things more seriously. And so he's telling me he had this dream, about, that he should convert to Christianity. I'm thinking, it's your subconscious or something like this, but I'm saying, okay, but, go ahead and do it. And so, but after that, because it required interpretation and going to his book and stuff like this, he specifically prayed. He said, God, can you give me a dream that I don't need to interpret? Give me something so clear I don't need to interpret it. So that's what he prayed. And then he calls me up. He calls me up and he says, David, can God give dreams in Christianity? Well, there are lots of people that God gave dreams to in the Bible, yeah. And he said, okay, see if you can interpret this. He said, I'm standing outside the narrow door, and I look through the door, and you're inside at this big feast. And I know that I want to be in the feast, and I know that this is like heaven or something, but I yell to you and I say, David, I thought we were going to eat together. And you said, I invited you, but you never responded. He goes, Could you interpret this? And I go, I don't need to interpret it. Turn to Luke 13. And he didn't tell me this until later after he became a Christian, but he said, he opened it up and it said the narrow door. Right? It said the narrow door, and you will look inside at the feast of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you yourself on the outside, and so on. And so when he told me that, I was like, hey, maybe there is something to this dream stuff, right? That's not him having some random dream. That's him dreaming a parable out of the Bible that he's never read. And so anyway, it still didn't, still months after that when he actually became a Christian, and it was cool. We started off by debates because Muslims were challenging us to debate, and eventually he joined Ravi Zacharias International Ministries, preached around the world, wrote 3 books. 2 of them were New York Times bestsellers, and was about to start work on his 2nd doctorate at Oxford University, and got a diagnosis of stage 4 stomach cancer. And so died a little over a year after getting the diagnosis, and that was just a couple months ago now. So.
Right. Great story. You'll come tomorrow and hear more about David's personal testimony. Again, 6:30 here. The doors will open at about 6 o'clock.
So the last 2 questions kind of led up to what I was thinking about here. And bringing it really home to San Antonio, the numbers that I'm hearing is well over 40,000, maybe as many as 50,000 Muslims are living here in our city. Much of them congregated around the medical center area, most of them living in apartments. I was out working in my yard this weekend, and there was an open house next door in a nice, quiet neighborhood, a little older neighborhood, about 3-4 miles from the medical center. And I saw one after another car come by. Muslims got out. Obviously, we're looking at the home. Is that something that's beginning to happen? They're going to move more out into the neighborhoods? Anything we need to be thinking about?
Well, of course, you have lots of Muslim immigration, and you have different kinds. You have Muslims who just come over for school, but then they end up getting a career and staying here. You have Muslims who come. Who intend from the beginning to move to the West, and you have Muslims who are born and raised here, and Muslims generally have higher birth rates than non-Muslims, and so the population is going to continue to grow. And so yes, Muslims are going to be in your neighborhoods, and you should look at that. What an awesome opportunity, right? 14 centuries of Christians. If you had a heart for Muslims, you wanted to go reach Muslims, you're going to go to the Middle East and get your head chopped off, right? And Jesus told us, go make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. And there's a huge block in the Muslim world where, okay, come over here to baptize in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. We're going to chop your head off. Right? And then those nations are now coming to us. And there are those there who want to come and subjugate our population. They're there. But there's a response, and it's built into Christianity. We have the truth, and we can show them the truth. And so, if a Muslim moves into your neighborhood, very probably not there to kill you, just trying to live a normal life and trying to go to trying to have make a better life for his kids, the same as other people. But I mean, think about that. Something that back in the day, you would have had to dedicate your life and maybe give up your life to go talk to a Muslim, and now they move right into your neighborhood. And just so everyone knows, 2 things. Muslims culturally tend to be very hospitable. People show up at my door, I'm got like 2 seconds to get my attention, or that door is going closed. I got kids inside back, right? Muslims will invite you in for tea and coffee, just as a matter of culture, if you show up at your door, if they're from certain areas. But also, we've been trained, hey, you don't want to talk about certain things because, political issues and religious issues might offend people, but lots of Muslims would absolutely love to talk to you about religious issues because they believe you're wrong and they want to show you the truth of Islam. And it would be very cool for them to, help convert a Christian to Islam, and they think you've been brainwashed by the media to have a negative view of Muslims, and they want to correct you and show you that Muslims are nice and loving. So they would be happy to invite you in and have these discussions. And so, I mean, think about this. Here we are. We want to tell Muslims the truth. They're there. They're willing to have the conversation. Now we're in the same neighborhood. My goodness, what is stopping us? I don't know.
Could that also?
What's that?
Could that also be an aspect of the caliphate?
I'm not sure it's an aspect of the caliphate. What we have to overcome is the fear of Muslims. One of the things, we need to be honest about Islam, but it's one of the things that Mark and Susan do in going out and tell people how to have that engagement and to overcome that fear and to talk. It's obviously encouraging the same thing. Yes, sir. Next question.
I'm a person that studied history, and of course I belong to a religious entity, a religious church, the Eastern Orthodox. And they had an empire, it's called the Byzantine Empire. It was a great civilization in the world. There was also an Nestorian civilization in Afghanistan. These civilizations are gone. At one point, the Muslims invaded Spain. They had 2/3 of Spain. They took over about a quarter to a third of France. And they went all the way to Vienna. How come we're so blind historically not to recognize it? I mean, it's dangerous. You know, you talk about the gift of discouragement. It's a gift when you're discouraging people from doing stupid things and hurt them. And it's not a phobia when when these people really want to hurt you. And it's been proven that they do.
The short answer to how do we still not get this, right? We've seen it over and over again for 14 centuries. Every time we really want to believe Islam is peaceful and tolerant, another terrorist group tries to convince us of the truth about Islam, and it doesn't matter how many times you tell us, we still will not believe what the religion teaches. I'd say that the short answer is people are very easy to manipulate, and if you make people feel good, they'll go along with it. If you make people feel bad, they don't want any more of that. And it's just the fact that if you talk about Islam and start talking about Jihad or criticizing Muhammad, you're going to get massive amounts of abuse heaped on you. And that doesn't feel good. That feels bad. You're told that you're a bad person and you're a racist and a bigot and a hate monger, every awful thing that you could possibly be. That's what you are if you criticize Islam. And if you praise Islam, if you say Islam is a wonderful religion, then you get praises heaped on you. You're such a wonderful person, you're so kind, you're so tolerant, and so on. If that thing happens over and over and over again throughout your life, and it's starting early now. My son was, I believe, in 7th grade, and it was September 11th. And the teacher asked who was responsible for the September 11th attacks. He didn't just say Muslims, he clarified. The teacher said, who was responsible for the September 11th attacks? And my son said, Muslim extremists. He said half the class turned to him and started calling him racist. Now that is 7th grade. I understood college, right? I understood this happening in college because by college you've been indoctrinated. I had no idea that by the time you've gotten to 7th grade, you don't just say, hey, what's your problem with Muslims or something? You immediately pull the race card whenever someone mentions a fact, right? I mean, this is a fact that was an answer to a teacher who's asking a question, and Luke responded with a fact. And didn't even just say, Muslims, Muslim extremists, and that has something to do with race. And they've already been programmed to respond like that. So if you're programmed to respond like that now from elementary school on up, then by the time you get to our time and someone says, hey, you know all the stuff that's been going on in Islam for 14 centuries? That's because it has something to do, they're so biased by that point that even entertaining the thought that this has something to do with Islam would make them feel like an evil, dirty person and a racist. And so there's obviously a negative side of that, namely you can sway, these are the people who run the media and politicians and so on are all like this. They've all been victims to this kind of straightforward psychological manipulation. But there's a positive side to it, namely, once all the weak-minded people have given themselves over, you have a bunch of very tough-minded people who can't be controlled like that. And if you have a small population of people who cannot be manipulated by those tactics, I'd say you have a good chance of changing changing the world.
In our textbook review, the ones that were going to be here in Texas in 2014, we looked at the section. One of the publishers had no mention of Islam, Muslims, Saudi Arabia. It only said terrorists flew planes into the Twin Towers.
Oh, by the way, side note, it's 9 o'clock, and I know some people have to go, but you don't want to hurt my feelings. If there are people here who still have questions, I'd be happy to hang out.
We'll go with two more questions and then we'll wrap it.
Yeah, but people who have to leave, you're not hurting my feelings. I'm a sociopath. You're not hurting my feelings by leaving. Those of you who want to stay, we can stay here all night.
Thank you, David. We need to get out of here because probably Pastor Branson needs to get this last in and regard it.
Yes, I was curious as to see if you had heard of Walid Shabbat.
Yeah.
Shabbat, what are your thoughts on him, I guess?
I don't want to say negative things about people that I have a very negative opinion of on certain things. I'll say that.
Okay, and last question, or next to the last question.
Dr. Wood, thank you for coming. But my question is, what is your take on Zudi Jasser's movement in his Reformation?
I believe he's sincere. I don't believe in other words, when people tell me, how there's this peaceful Islam and so on, sometimes I think they're trying to trick me with Zudi. I believe he's sincere. I don't believe he's practicing taqiyya or trying to trick me, but I believe that these movements are just doomed to failure. And the reason is, if you tell people, hey, Islam is wonderful, Islam is peaceful, we're going to have this reform movement that brings you peace, there are always going to be people who say, wait a minute, Allah says there's no option other than complete obedience. The religion means submission. The central requirement of the religion is submission. How do I submit according to this religion? By just completely obeying Allah, Muhammad. What does he say? Fight those who do not believe in Allah. In other words, once you've reformed it to something that is no longer that, it's no longer submission, it's no longer Islam. So, I understand this tendency to want to make something wonderful and just call it Islam, but if it's no longer Islam according to religion, then say I'm forming a new, peaceful, monotheistic religion. Right? Okay.
David, we belonged to this organization a couple of years. In that particular meeting that was held over in Incarnate Word, Sister Martha was the person that was to regulate it. Anyway, another woman that belongs to our group here couldn't come tonight, but she and I went to it. Well, what did happen is we were a little late. Well, when Sister Martha left, everything broke loose. They were very, very scary with us. We got up to speak. The woman put on her headpiece and started on us, and it was terrible. And I want to say, maybe if a man was there with us, it would have been better, but when we went to speak and speak gently and kindly, they were absolutely on top of us. We left with our tail between our legs. It was very upsetting, and you think that's America.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes.
Last question.
I was very blessed by the testimony of your friend's conversion, and I would like to glorify the Lord with this song in Arabic for His glory. Undika kulil majdi, you deserve the honor and the glory. Undika kulil majdi wal karamati, arfau yadayana waka wa usabi husmaka. Undika kulil majdi wal karamati, arfau yadayana waka wa usabi husmaka. You deserve the honor and the glory as we lift our hands to heaven and exalt your holy name. You are great. You do miracles so great. There is no one else like you, Lord. There is no one else like you. You are great. You do miracles so great. There is no one else like you. There is no one else like you.
Probably haven't had that kind of finish on any of your speeches before. So I want to say thanks to David again.